In 1838, in the town of Moundsville, in what was then Virginia and is now West Virginia, a group of men cut a tunnel into the side of a hill that wasn't a hill. It was a mound, the Grave Creek Mound, one of the largest conical burial mounds anywhere in North America, around 60 feet tall and some 240 feet across at its base. A man-made mountain of earth that had stood over the Ohio Valley for the better part of 2,000 years. People had wondered about it for generations. In 1838, a local family, the Tomlinsons, decided to stop wondering and start digging. They didn't go in gently. They drove a horizontal shaft straight into the heart of the mound, and then a vertical one down from the top, hunting for whatever the builders had hidden at the center. What they found, deep inside, were burial vaults, timber-lined chambers stacked one above the other. Inside lay human skeletons, and around them the things the living had sent with the dead. Shell beads, copper ornaments, ivory, thousands of small treasures laid down by a people who had vanished long before any European set foot on the continent. And, according to the account that would echo for the next century and a half, somewhere in that excavation they found a small flat disk of sandstone about the size of the palm of your hand. On one face of it were carved characters, around 24 of them, neat, deliberate marks arranged in rows. Writing. Stop and feel the weight of that, the way the men in 1838 would have felt it. This was a continent that, according to everything the educated world believed, had no writing before Columbus. The native peoples of North America built mounds, traded across thousands of miles, tracked the stars, but they did not, the textbooks insisted, leave behind alphabets. There were no inscriptions, no carved sentences waiting in the ground. And here was a stone covered in what looked exactly like an alphabet, pulled from a sealed tomb, older than the oldest cathedral in Europe. There was a hunger in 1838 for exactly this kind of find. White America had convinced itself, against the evidence, that the great mounds couldn't have been built by the ancestors of the native peoples, being pushed off the land at that very moment. A lost race, Phoenicians, Israelites, wandering Europeans, was a more comfortable story, because a vanished mystery civilization left no one to feel guilty about. A stone with strange writing fed that hunger perfectly. It told the audience what a great many of them already wanted to hear. Imagine the air inside that shaft, damp earth, the smell of 2,000-year-old timber, lamplight catching on copper and bone. The men working it were not archaeologists, they were diggers, driven by curiosity and the promise of whatever the mound might be worth, hauling out the dead of a people whose name they did not know. If it was real, it meant someone had been writing in the Ohio Valley thousands of years before they were supposed to. It meant the story of who reached this land, and when, and what they could do, was incomplete in a way that would force every history book to be rewritten. If it was a fake, then it was one of the most successful frauds in American history, one that pulled in famous scholars, crossed the ocean, and refused to die for more than 170 years. There's just one problem standing between you and the answer. You can't examine the Grave Creek stone, not because it's locked in a vault, not because anyone sealed it away, because the stone is gone, lost. Somewhere across the years it slipped out of the world, and today the original does not exist. What survives are a handful of plaster casts and a great pile of arguments. So this is a mystery told entirely in echoes, copies of copies, readings of readings, the testimony of men long dead about an object no living person can hold. And before anyone could even decide what the marks meant, they ran into a stranger problem first. They couldn't agree on what language it was. The inscription on the Grave Creek stone was small, somewhere around 24 characters, most counts landing near 25, carved into one face of the little sandstone disc. You could take in the whole thing in a glance if you could read it at all. Nobody could. That, by itself, wasn't damning. Plenty of ancient scripts resist translation. What turned the stone from a puzzle into a fight was what happened when the experts started trying. Casts and careful drawings of the inscription went out into the world, crossing the desks of antiquarians in America and Europe, and the readings that came back didn't just differ. They scattered. One scholar looked at the marks and saw Phoenician, the script of the ancient Mediterranean traders. Another saw Celtic-Iberian, the old writing of the Iberian Peninsula. Others reached for Runic, for Etruscan, for Greek, for the alphabets of ancient Britain. The same 24 scratches were confidently identified as half a dozen unrelated writing systems from opposite ends of the ancient world. And some didn't stop at naming the language. They translated it. The stone was said to read like a memorial, a name, a fragment of a forgotten tongue, each version as confident as the last, and each completely different. Here's the question that should be itching at you. If a stone carries real writing in a real language, you'd expect the experts to converge. Not instantly, not perfectly, but over time, the readings should pull toward each other, the way translators of a genuine ancient text eventually do. Instead, the Grave Creek readings flew apart. The more people studied it, the more languages it seemed to be. There's a reason a thing behaves that way, and it isn't a good one for the people who want it real. Marks that can be read as anything are often marks that mean nothing, shapes vague enough and generic enough that a determined scholar can map them onto whatever alphabet is already in his head. Show a believer in ancient Phoenicians a row of scratches, and he'll find Phoenicians. Consider how strange the disagreement really was. The same row of characters that one expert pronounced a Phoenician memorial, another read as ancient Gaelic, and a third as a blend of Etruscan and Runic. These aren't neighboring dialects. They're writing systems separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. No genuine inscription has ever been all of those at once. The only way a single short text gets read in a dozen unrelated alphabets is if it was never truly written in any of them. Real reputations went into this. Henry Schoolcraft, one of the most respected names in the early American study of native peoples, took the stone seriously and helped carry it into the scholarly record, even circulating the inscription to correspondents overseas. Wills de Haas, a physician and antiquarian, defended it. Their support gave the stone something a hoax desperately needs: credibility borrowed from honest men. Schoolcraft was no crank. He had spent years among the Ojibwe, had married into a prominent Ojibwe family, and was about as close to an authority on native life as the United States then possessed. When a man like that lends his name to a stone, the stone borrows his stature. That's exactly why a single credible endorsement can keep a doubtful object alive for decades. People trust the messenger and forget to test the message. The transatlantic traffic in copies mattered too. Once a drawing of the inscription reached Europe, it took on a life of its own, far from the mound and far from anyone who could check the circumstances of the find. A scholar in Paris or Copenhagen wasn't weighing a suspicious tourist attraction in Virginia. He was weighing a clean line drawing of mysterious letters, stripped of all the awkward context. Distance flattered the stone, but there was a countercamp, and it was just as serious. Ephraim Squire, who with Edwin Davis produced the foundational survey of the ancient mounds of North America, looked at the Grave Creek inscription and judged it a forgery. M.C. Reed lined up against it too. From almost the beginning, the smartest people in the room were split down the middle, and they stayed split for generations. So you had a stone that famous scholars swore was genuine, that other famous scholars swore was fake. That could be read in any language you liked, pulled from a tomb no one disputed was real, attached to an inscription almost no one could trust. Every translation pointed somewhere different, which left only two possibilities. Either the stone was older and stranger than history allowed, or someone, somewhere in 1838, had simply made it up. To figure out which, you have to stop looking at the letters and start looking at the men who opened the mound. Because they had a reason to want something remarkable to come out of the dark. And it had a dollar sign on it. Strip away the inscription for a moment and look at the mound itself, because the mound is the part of this story that is absolutely, unarguably real. The Grave Creek Mound was built by the people archaeologists call the Adena, a culture that flourished in the Ohio Valley roughly 2,000 to 2,500 years ago, in the centuries before and around the rise of Rome. They were mound builders on a scale that's hard to grasp. To raise Grave Creek, they moved tens of thousands of tons of earth, basket, by hand, over what may have been generations. They buried their dead in timbered vaults and heaped a small mountain over them. 10 years after the dig, in 1848, the Smithsonian Institution published its very first book, Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, by Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis. It was the foundation stone of American archaeology, a careful survey of the mounds. And its authors were deeply skeptical of the Grave Creek inscription. From the start, the people doing the most serious work on the mounds were the least convinced by the writing. That tells you something. It's worth saying plainly what the Adena did and didn't do, because the contrast is the whole point. They engineered enormous earthworks. They worked copper and carved stone. They ran trade networks that carried shell from the Gulf Coast and copper from the Great Lakes. What no one has ever found, at Grave Creek or any other Adena site, is a writing system. The mound is proof of genius. The inscription is the one element that doesn't fit the people who built everything around it. There is no mystery about whether the Adena existed, or whether they built the mound, or whether real human beings were laid to rest inside it with real treasures. All of that is solid ground. The skeletons were real. The copper and shell and ivory were real. The vaults were real. The stone is the one thing that floats free of all that certainty. And to understand why, you have to look at what the Tomlinson family did after they opened the mound. They turned it into a business. Having tunneled into one of the great wonders of the Ohio Valley, the family didn't quietly hand it to science. They built a structure over the excavation, opened the chambers to the public, and charged admission. People paid to walk into the heart of the ancient mound and see the vaults and the bones for themselves. There was a museum. There was, in the language of a later age, an attraction. And an attraction needs a draw. You don't have to assume anyone was a villain to see the problem. A famous, paying public excavation has a powerful, built-in appetite for spectacle. Skeletons are good. Treasure is better. But a stone covered in mysterious writing, a stone that might prove a lost civilization of literate ancients, once stood on this very spot. That is the kind of thing that sells tickets for years. The incentive to produce a marvel and the means to carve a little disc of soft sandstone sat in the very same hands. And the details of the find don't help the stone's case. The accounts of exactly when and where the inscribed disc turned up in the excavation are murky and inconsistent. It doesn't have the clean, well-witnessed discovery you'd want for an object this explosive. It surfaces in the story a little too conveniently, in a setting that had every reason to want it. None of that proves the stone is fake. Murky records and a profit motive are grounds for suspicion, not a verdict. The Adena were real, the mound was real, and it remains at least conceivable that a genuine artifact came out of it and was simply documented badly in the chaos of a 19th century dig. Even in the 19th century, the doubters had a sharp question that never got a clean answer. Why was the most extraordinary object in the entire excavation the one with the haziest paper trail? The skeletons were described, the vaults measured, the ornaments catalogued. But the inscribed disc drifts through the accounts, turning up at different points in different tellings, its exact find spot never quite nailed down. For the one item that could rewrite history, that vagueness is not a small thing. It's the whole difference between evidence and an anecdote. But suspicion is the right place to stand, and for over a century that's where the argument froze. Believers on one side, skeptics on the other, neither able to land the killing blow, because the one thing that could settle it was the stone itself, and the marks on it kept their secret. It would take more than 150 years, and one stubborn researcher willing to do the unglamorous work, before someone finally found where those 24 letters had really come from. And the answer was sitting in a book printed in 1752. For most of the Grave Creek stone's life, the argument over it ran in circles, because both sides were trapped looking at the same thing, the inscription, and seeing whatever they were already inclined to see. Believers saw an ancient alphabet. Skeptics saw nonsense. Neither could prove it, because you can't easily prove a row of letters is fake just by staring at it. The breakthrough came from changing the question. Instead of asking what the letters meant, one researcher asked where they came from. That researcher was the anthropologist David Oestreicher, and in 2008 he presented his findings to the West Virginia Archaeological Society. He had gone hunting not for a translation, but for a source, a place those exact shapes might have been copied from. And he found one. His method was the kind of patient, unglamorous detective work that rarely makes headlines. He didn't try to out-translate the translators. He went through old books of alphabets, the sort of antiquarian references an educated American of the 1830s could have owned, comparing shapes, hunting for the specific gallery of letters the carver had drawn from. The trail led to a Spanish volume from 1752, a study of unknown and ancient alphabets, where the Grave Creek characters appeared not as a message, but as a display of letter forms. The characters on the Grave Creek stone, Oestreicher showed, matched symbols printed in a book published in 1752, a Spanish-language work cataloguing ancient alphabets and the lettering found on old coins. The marks weren't a message from a lost civilization. They were a sampler, lifted from a printed reference, the kind of book a literate man in the 19th century could plausibly have reached. Somebody had copied old letters out of a book and carved them into a stone. Once you see it that way, the stone's greatest strength flips into its fatal weakness. The very thing that dazzled the early scholars, that the inscription seemed to echo so many ancient scripts at once, is precisely what a forger copying from a sampler of alphabets would produce. A real inscription speaks one language. This one spoke a dozen, badly, all at the same time, because it was never speaking at all. It was quoting a book. That single finding did to the Grave Creek stone what no amount of arguing over translations ever could. It gave the forgery a fingerprint. It explained, all at once, why the inscription could be read as Phoenician and Celtic-Iberian and half a dozen other scripts, because it was assembled out of a grab bag of real ancient letters, pulled from a catalogue of exactly those alphabets. Of course, scholars could find Phoenician in it. The Phoenician was in there, copied straight off the page, sitting next to letters from unrelated systems that no genuine inscription would ever combine. Oestreicher's work hardened the scholarly consensus that the Grave Creek stone is a 19th century fraud, most likely created right around the time of the excavation, by someone with the book, the motive, and the access. Some accounts point to a man close to the dig. The precise hand may never be known. But the mechanism is no longer a mystery. This is the point where honesty matters, because the case isn't unanimous, and pretending it is would be its own kind of fraud. There are still defenders of the stone, some connected to communities like certain Book of Mormon researchers, with their own reasons to want pre-Columbian writing in America to be real. They contest the forgery verdict and argue the inscription is authentic. They're entitled to make the case, but weigh it honestly. On one side, a stone with a murky discovery, pulled from a paid tourist attraction, readable as any language you please, defended by people with a stake in the outcome. On the other, a documented match to a printed book of alphabets that predates the find. The scales don't sit level. They tip hard toward forgery. And here's the twist that makes this stone worth a whole story. The Grave Creek stone was supposed to be evidence that ancient people wrote in America. What it may actually prove is something almost more interesting: how convincingly a past can be manufactured, and how badly serious, intelligent people want to believe in a hidden chapter of history. But even Oestreicher's work can't fully close the case, because there's one test no one will ever get to run. You can't put the original stone under a modern microscope. You can't analyze the cuts, date the weathering, settle it once and for all. The stone is gone, and how it vanished is the last, strangest part of the story. For an object that started one of the longest-running arguments in American archaeology, the Grave Creek stone has a quietly devastating final fact attached to it. Nobody knows where it is. The original, the actual disc of sandstone that came out of the mound in 1838, the thing every scholar fought over, the object that could, in theory, be tested today with tools its discoverers couldn't have dreamed of, is lost. Somewhere across the long decades, as it passed through hands and collections and the slow attrition of time, it slipped out of the record and never came back. What remains are 4 plaster casts, kept at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. Copies, shadows of a thing no one can produce. Picture those casts: 4 pale plaster discs in a drawer, each a faithful negative of an object that no longer exists. Researchers still pull them out, still photograph them, still argue over the curve of a line that was pressed into plaster from a stone gone missing for generations. It's a strange kind of relic worship, venerating the impression of a thing because the thing itself walked off into history. Think about what that means. For more than 170 years, people have argued about whether a stone is genuine. And for most of that time, the stone hasn't even been in the room. The debate outlived the object. We've been fighting over a ghost. This is where the legend and the truth finally meet. The story that travels with stones like this one always wants a single haunted figure. The man who read the inscription and then fell silent, who carried the secret to his grave and never spoke of it again. The real silence is bigger and colder than any one man. It's the silence of the stone itself. It went quiet by disappearing. The famous scholars who championed it died. The skeptics who doubted it died. The Tomlinsons and their paying museum faded into local history. And the inscription everyone was so sure they could almost read sank back into the dark it came from, taking its answer with it. The debate didn't end with a verdict everyone trusts. It ended the way these things usually end. Not with proof, but with exhaustion and absence and a row of plaster casts in a museum drawer. And the Grave Creek stone has company. It sits in a whole family of disputed American and Old World inscriptions, each its own argument that never quite closes. The Newton stone in Scotland, carved with a script no one can name for certain. Dighton Rock in Massachusetts, scrawled with markings read as Norse, Portuguese, Phoenician, and Native American by turns. The Kensington Rune Stone in Minnesota, with its tale of medieval Scandinavians in the heart of the continent. Different places, different centuries, the same shape of longing underneath. The hope that the official story is missing a chapter, and that the missing chapter is buried somewhere, waiting, with our name carved in a language we've forgotten how to read. And the deeper pattern is the one worth carrying out of this. The Grave Creek stone was born from the mound builder myth, the wish for the mounds to belong to anyone but the native peoples whose ancestors actually raised them. The disputed inscriptions that came after it, on both sides of the ocean, drink from the same well. The desire to rewrite who was here and when, and to make the deep past say our own names back to us. The marks change, the longing doesn't. Go back to the tunnel. 1838, the dark interior of the mound, the lamplight, the vaults, the bones, and a small flat stone passing from a dirty hand into the light, its surface crowded with letters that looked, for one electric moment, like a message meant for us across 2,000 years. That moment was real, even if the message wasn't. Someone did stand in the heart of an ancient tomb and hold a stone covered in writing. The thrill of it was true. It's just that the thrill, and not the inscription, may have been the only authentic thing about it. The Grave Creek stone's last secret was never really about the Adena, or Phoenicians, or a lost alphabet in the Ohio Valley. It's about the people standing over the hole in the ground, then and now, wanting so badly for the marks to mean something that they were willing to read a message into anything. The stone is gone. The wish that carved it is still here. And that, in the end, is the only inscription that never needed translating.